With the next patch, Hydrastar and Hydra's Lament will see a nerf. A quite unfortunate nerf in my opinion. The cooldown reduction on both items will be reduced by 5%. In this video we go a little in depth about the implications of this, as many people have already asked me who they should even build the item on. And we're gonna address exactly that here and look through all the gods that have made use of this item before. Before we begin with that, let's take a look back at the comparison to the next best item that has always been Jotunn's Wrath. Now Jotunn's Wrath has been in the meta for 3 seasons. It was pushed out a little bit in between by Void Shield. With Void Shield becoming more expensive, it's a little less popular while still being good. And now we had Hydra's Lament basically reigning supreme for a while, as it was really good on a lot of assassins, and you would often pick it over Jotunn's Wrath due to the reworked passive that allowed you to get MP5 at all times. The MP5 stays the same, so in that regard nothing has changed. What has changed is simply the cooldown reduction, but that's not so insignificant. Especially because the cooldown reduction is removed from the tier 2 item as well, Hydrastar. It's important to take a look at that as well. And here we already see a shift. Hydrastar has 5% cooldown reduction, 20 power and 10% extra damage for your next swing. So this 10% extra damage really doesn't matter much for most gods. What is left is the 20 power and 5% cooldown reduction. Heavy Mace always has been more expensive, so it's less accessible in that regard. It has 25 power and 10 flat penetration. It is 5 more power, 5 power, well, have it or don't have it, but it doesn't really matter that much. 10 penetration though, in my opinion, outweighs 5% cooldown reduction. Yes, 5% cooldown reduction can be nice, but 10 penetration is just a significant chunk of damage that you get extra against targets with low defenses early on, and really Hydrastar can't make up for that with that little cooldown reduction. When it was still 10% cooldown reduction, one of the big perks was that this was one of the easiest, most accessible way to get quick cooldown reduction, which is especially important for those gods who A, need their abilities for fast rotations, and B, need their ultimates quite often for ganks and stuff like that, so junglers. With half of the cooldown reduction gone here, I feel like the item loses a lot of value for that purpose at least. But we could still build into Hydra's Lament if Hydra's Lament is still worth it, right? So Hydra's Lament now has 40 power, same as Jotunn's Wrath. It has 30% extra damage for your next basic after an ability, and it has 10% cooldown reduction. Whereas Jotunn's Wrath has the 10 penetration and 20% reduction. 5%, well, on one hand it's not much if you only have 5%, but taking away 5% still means something. You have to consider here that beforehand, Hydra's Lament gave you 3/4 of Jotunn's Wrath cooldown reduction. Now it gives you half of the cooldown reduction. And I think that's important enough of a difference to make a change for quite a few gods. If you're very cooldown reliant for your abilities like your ultimate, then those 10% will matter even early on. If your ability chain comes up more often, if you have that 10% cooldown reduction, then it will matter if it's the difference between using an ability twice in a fight or once in a fight. 5% on its own, usually not that much, but if it's a total of 10% difference for a relatively close price, then you kind of have to start to wonder. On the upside, there is still the MP5 on Hydra's Lament. And this MP5, as we have already concluded in the past, is usually much better than the flat mana on Jotunn's Wrath, just because it gives you more over time while staying in the jungle, and it doesn't really take long for it to be more effective. So if you're on a very mana hungry god, there is a bit more of a reason to build it. With that, let's look at all the gods in particular and see where I think it makes sense, where I think it doesn't make sense, and where I'm not so sure yet. What we'll specifically talk about here is building it in 3rd slot after Bomba's Mask and your boots. So it's not about if you should build Hydra's Lament at all. I think it's still a great item for later slots especially, even though the MP5 gives you a little less of a benefit then. But this is more about what should you build after boots, what's more beneficial for your character, and how can you make it work. And therefore we're looking at just this particular slot and not the item as a whole. We go through the gods alphabetically, ordered by the kind of application that I think it has or doesn't have for them now. We begin with the gods where I think the item no longer really makes sense to be built right after boots. The first one is Fenrir. Fenrir has heavy ability damage already early on, especially with the Brutalize. There's a lot of damage coming from that, and I don't think Hydra's Lament can really compensate for that anymore with that extra damage gone, because he was never too much about the attack cancel. Yes, with his 2, you can actually build him a little differently. I think Dimmy did this, where he would not max out the Brutalize at all if you played him solo, and then just went into Hydra's Lament for the attack cancel and got extra damage that way. But I feel like, especially if you're playing him in jungle, you need that extra cooldown reduction early on, because you want to use your ult as often as possible, force the enemy's beats, or even get a kill on them. And with 10% less cooldown reduction, that's quite a significant chunk for him. 10% cooldown reduction on a 90-second ultimate is 9 seconds after all, and that adds up over the match. The next one is one where most people didn't even build the item so often, and that's Mercury. I like the item very much on Mercury because I thought that it's really nice to combine the 1 proc with Hydra's Lament, but I think now it's just a little more beneficial to go straight up into a more crit-oriented build, stuff like that, and not just kind of have this bridge item in between anymore. I think with it having less of a reason to be built in general, for Mercury, there's even less of a reason to do so. Naja is kind of in a similar boat. For Naja, it was always the matter of dealing less damage in his ultimate if he built into Hydras, because the pen and the crit works together, and as such, now I would really not build on him anymore. I don't see much of a point, because Naja is once again an assassin where you really want to have that ult as often as possible to get those heavy early picks. Nemesis is also in that category. With Nemesis, I feel like it's still a great item as the next slot, but Nemesis needs as much cooldown reduction as early as possible for her ultimate, which is all she works around, and also she needs as much damage as possible early on in order to be able to clear the jungle effectively. It only really works for her in one particular build, a build where you go into attack cancels and crit later, so I would say get it in 3rd slot instead if you want to go for that build. Thor. Thor is one of those where it was always a bit debatable, because he has such nice base damage on his ability and nice scalings and all, that he could work very well off just going into Jotuns beforehand. But the problem was for him that it was just more beneficial to have Hydras because of the mana and allowing for that strong attack cancel with his chain and all that stuff. That's all still there, but with the little less benefit that Hydras has overall, I feel like it's once again more of a Jotun's focus for Thor players, simply because it provides you with a lot, and the early ultimates and the cooldown reduction for the early ultimates is just very, very helpful. He was never the one where you had to build Hydra's Lament first. There was always the option to go Jotuns. So with Jotuns being, well, relatively better again, now I would say Thor is probably not going to make as much use of it anymore. That brings us to the question marks. These gods are gods that have a bit more of a reason to still build it, whereas I'm not entirely sure if they really should. First one here is Awilix. Awilix has her Feather Step for early damage, and in that regard Jotun's Wrath is very strong, and the cooldown reduction helps you getting it off in a fight twice, and for that it's very, very good, so I would kind of lean towards that. At the same time, Awilix has extremely high mana consumption due to Suku costing mana whenever you mount up, and that's always been a problem. Usually you can work around that with blue potions and stuff like that, but really it's kind of an iffy situation now. If you really want the MP5, you can still build Hydra's Lament for that, but if you want the highest damage, you kind of want to go for Jotuns, so I'm not quite sure where to place her, especially knowing that it is quite often the case that your low cooldown ability, being Feather Step, comes off cooldown right when you need it, when you have that little bit of extra cooldown reduction with Jotun's Wrath, and if you just have 10% less cooldown reduction, it will mean that kills will get away because that didn't happen. I'll skip someone in the alphabetical order here because there are 3 gods that kind of apply for the same thing here. Another one that stands out is Batz. Batz had a little bit more of a benefit from Hydra's Lament due to the interaction with his passive, with the crit, meaning that he would be able to get even more out of that Hydra's passive if he crit. So it gave him a significant early boost in terms of damage, and I think that's still, as that is still there, it's very beneficial for him in that regard. The problem is that at the same time, he really wants cooldown reduction early on to get his ultimate up as often as possible, and he really needs that. So I'm not quite sure anymore. He's one of those where you could maybe just switch up Jotun's Wrath and Hydra's Lament in the build, depending on the situation, maybe depending on the enemy's defense or something like that. But I can't really tell yet where it's going to end up for him, and I see reasons for both sides here. For Camazotz, Ratatoskr, and Thanatos, the same thing applies. They all kind of work more around ability damage, but do attack cancels that can help them a lot. And they have attack swings between their abilities and stuff like that. The point here, or the reason why I'm putting that in this in-between slot, is because they have high ability damage, they also cancel, but primarily they all have some kind of self-sustain. So they are able to stay in the jungle longer, and if you use Hydra's Lament, then you have the mana, whereas your abilities, which you can then use more often, allow you to heal up more. And combining that allows you to just go back whenever you need to and not when you're just poked out, because you can always heal up better than others. And that's kind of a situation where it's harder to decide if it's still worth it or not. I would probably generally tend towards going more for Jotuns on those who I feel I need it. With Thanatos it's a bit different because he has that built-in pen, so he makes a little bit more of Hydras. In that regard, again, really weird spot for those gods, especially because all of them can also go for completely different build options. That brings us to the last two, where I would say, yeah, maybe there's more of a reason to still build on these gods. I wouldn't say you have to, but there is a reason to rush this after boots, or even before. One is Loki, and Loki, we're talking specifically solo lane here, where some people, not everyone, but some people have done Hydra's Lament starts, where they basically replaced Transcendence with Hydra's Lament due to the MP5 built-in, and that works pretty well, and it still works in the same way. You just have a little less cooldown reduction, but that's not really that relevant for your laning phase. So I would say in that regard, there's still good enough of a reason to build it at all times if you build it before. And the other one is Susano. The difference between Susano and the others is that he has a ridiculous amount of attack cancels. On his 1 alone, he can have up to 3 amped up Hydras, then he has his 3 and his 2 as well, and his ultimate, so his whole kit is attack cancelling or attack swings right after an ability in regards to the 2. He can obviously go Jotuns as well because he has that high ability damage too, but I think there's just more of a reason than on others to stick with this current build. Also because he's not as dependent on cooldown reduction. He's gonna get his mobility anyways, he typically chunks enemies within one ability rotation, and really his ultimate is not as essential to him as to other characters, because he can still easily get a kill without it. The last one, who's a little bit in her own category here, is Batz. Batz was never a god where you would rush this item because she just doesn't work that much with ability cancels compared to others, and her ability damage itself is very, very high. So in that regard, nothing changes. The thing is that for her, Hydra's Lament is still good late game if you want to go for more structure damage or if you want to go for some poke in between. It's not perfect in every situation, but it's still decent and nothing has changed about that because of the CDR. Simply because she just needs any aggressive CDR option possible as long as you're not looking to go into anything tanky. Generally speaking, I think as a later stage item, Hydra's Lament has the same value as before. The 5% is not going to matter all that much then. But in the early game, where the CDR is very important to be as effective as possible, I think this will make a difference for a lot of characters. How big the difference will actually be in the end is something we yet have to figure out. But I think there's just a lot more of a reason to go back to Jotuns, which I think is a little disappointing, because I like to have something else being a little more dominant in the meta for a while. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you for the next one tomorrow. SLOTH, out.